What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. This week, I'm talking to investigative reporter Michael Moss, who's spent many years discovering just what it is about processed and fast food that makes it so hard for many of us to resist. This is the final podcast of 3 that I'm doing in conjunction with the International Food Addiction Consensus Conference held on the 17th of May. Michael says he now believes that particular combinations of flavour, texture, fat, protein and carbohydrate actually creates food that can become addictive. So just what's the evidence for this? But before we get to Michael's interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. And now back to Michael's interview. Michael Moss is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's a former investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. And he's written 2 best-selling books about processed and fast food, including Hooked: How the Food Giants Exploit Our Addictions, produced by Ebury Publishing. Here's Michael's interview. Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Michael, you've written a number of books and articles about the fast food and processed food industry, which are pretty tough on the industry. So I imagine you're not on the Christmas card list for many food execs.
I feel like they wish I'd never was born, but in fact, you'd be surprised. I think most of them would agree that the sort of reporting I've done has been fierce and harsh, but also fair and accurate, using kind of their own documents and their own people to sort of look at them. So they don't have a lot of pushback.
Now, it's interesting when you look at the question of whether a substance is addictive or not. In the past, the defense of the tobacco industry, which one tobacco exec used, was that cigarettes were no more addictive than Twinkies, which for those who are not the American audience is an American snack cake. But of course, if you buy that argument, the other potential way of framing this is that the substances are both equally addictive.
Yeah. Of course, if you take that forward all the way, it was none other than the tobacco industry who sort of fell on that sword. You're right. For decades, they fought fiercely against the notion that cigarettes were addictive. Yes, maybe they weren't good for you, but personal responsibility, personal choice is what kind of drove their marketing and their sales. But starting in the mid-1990s, a jury decided that, yes, indeed, there is something addictive about cigarettes, and there's at least a shared responsibility among the tobacco companies, which was a huge kind of moment. And ultimately, the tobacco companies settled. So now, in kind of looking at this question of whether some foods and our trouble with food should be framed as an addiction, that history of tobacco is looming really, really large, not just in terms of public opinion, but also in terms of potential, litigation strategy from people who've been hurt by this dependency on processed food.
And ironically, the tobacco company Philip Morris at one point diversified and moved into the food industry, although I think now it no longer owns Kraft and General Foods, which it once did.
Yeah, that was a huge moment in the growing dependency of people in the United States and eventually the world. Back in the mid-1980s, Philip Morris, with tons of cash from the tobacco business, bought the old company General Foods, and then Kraft, and then Nabisco. And up until the early 2000s, it was the single largest producer of processed food in the United States. My sense of what the tobacco industry brought to the food industry was tons of cash to develop products, just kind of like a bravado. And I'll give you one example. Bob Drain invented the Lunchables for kids. And I don't know if your folks know what Lunchables are, but
I think The US audience will, but for the people listening who are not in the US, that would be helpful if
Yeah,
you could.
it's this little tray that started out filled with little bits of processed ham and processed cheese and crackers. And Kraft invented it because people were eating less bologna sandwiches and they needed a new way to market those products. Bob Drain and his team of geniuses came up with the Lunchables. It kind of looks like a little bento box that you have in Japan. Needed money to sort of develop his prototype. And so he flew to New York to meet with the tobacco managers at Philip Morris. They heard his pitch and they looked at him kind of dumbfounded and said, Bob, why so timid? You've just invented a product that people will find irresistible. And that's what the tobacco industry brought to food.
And when you say the tobacco industry, do you mean Philip Morris alone, or were there other tobacco companies too?
Yeah, there was RJR Nabisco before Philip Morris, who had Nabisco, the maker of Oreo cookies and stuff, which eventually Philip Morris acquired. So there were those two giants.
The idea that fast food or ultra-processed food might be addictive seemed to hit home, particularly after a 2003 court case ruling in the US, which was brought by a teenager called Jaslyn Bradley.
Yeah, I took a look at that. I started out as a total skeptic. I mean, the idea of comparing Twinkies, my boyhood friends, right, growing up, to heroin seemed absolutely ludicrous. I mean, the word addiction just seemed too harsh. And in my first book, I kind of avoided using the A word. It just kind of seemed too much. But yes, 2003, a couple of teenage girls in the Bronx in New York brought a case against McDonald's for making them obese. The linchpin of that case became this question of addiction. And the judge handling the case ultimately dismissed it. It didn't go anywhere. But the judge, in kind of his decisions, was really fascinated by this question of addiction because the industry was arguing, McDonald's was arguing that, look, people know that junk food isn't like great for you and you probably shouldn't be eating it day in, day out. But the judge was sort of saying, however, okay, that's true, personal responsibility, but there's something about these products that destroys our free will, if you will, our ability to kind of say no, clouds our brain, then maybe you've got a legal case to make here.
And following this lawsuit, 26 states, I think, passed what were called cheeseburger bills, which basically granted immunity to further prosecution with any claim about the addictive nature of fast food.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, Liz. The food industry was so worried about kind of this addiction argument. They saw what happened in the tobacco industry, that they got some 26 states to pass laws that would actually prevent someone like Jaslyn bringing a case arguing that the food caused them to kind of lose control of their eating habits. Kind of crazy when you look back. You're not even able in the States to bring that kind of case, much less sort of have a chance of winning it.
Has that basically brought any chance of further litigation to a complete halt?
Yeah, I think the attorneys, big tort attorneys, class action lawyers, go after things like big pharma and asbestos and big oil, have trouble looking at food kind of for that reason. The proliferation of these cheeseburger laws has acted as a disincentive to have really smart attorneys look at big food as a potential litigation area.
Now, one of the scientists you spoke to in your research was somebody called Dana Small, who said it's not so much that food's addictive, but rather that we by nature are drawn to eating and the companies change the food.
Yeah, I love Dana Small. She's a neuroscientist. She's famous for being the first person to get images of the brain on food, because she realized that while one can't chew when you're in the MRI, it'll blur the images. She realized if she put a square of Lindt chocolate on her subjects as she slid them into the MRI, that chocolate would melt over their tongue without them needing to sort of move their mouth, and got the first images of food. It was almost kind of pushback I got from Dana, because I asked, what do you think about this addiction question? She said, Michael, we are drawn to food in very powerful ways that cause us to not only eat, but to overeat. And in the last 50 years, the processed food industry has so dramatically changed the nature of our food in the way that allows overeating to be an everyday thing. So from Dana's, perspective, we're in this incredible biological mismatch now between our body and our brain's ability to kind of regulate what we're consuming and the industry's ability to maximize the allure of their products in ways that causes us to lose control.
If you look at the figures in the US, 3/4 of calories come from processed food. The UK, we're not that far behind. Other European countries, slightly better. But what is it about processed food in particular that offers the potential for addiction?
Right. I went through in the first book all the sort of engineering that goes into it, the sugar, which they call the bliss point. It's not just that they perfected the amount of sugar in things that should be sweet. They marched around the grocery store adding sugar to things that didn't used to be sweet. So now we have this expectancy that everything should be sweet.
So that would be putting sugar into savory food where we wouldn't necessarily expect to see sugar.
Yeah, bread, yogurt, spaghetti sauce, called the flavor burst because it's the first thing typically that touches the tongue and sends that same signal to the reward center of the brain. It lights up and goes, wow, Michael, I love that. Let's eat more of that. Fats and oils, or what they call the mouthfeel. It's that sensation of biting into a toasted cheese sandwich, right? And you could probably tell I'm more of a salt and fat guy than sugar because my brain is lighting up right now just kind of thinking about that. There's the incredible psychology that they weave into their products. I spent time with Jeff Dunn, former president of Coca-Cola for North America, South America. He explained to me why they fight so hard to get a soda in the hands of kids when they go to the ballpark with their parents, because that moment will forevermore get associated in their brains with joy and happiness. Memory is a huge component of processed foods because we begin developing memory and habits for foods at a really young age. But here's the things that Dana sort of explained to me, which is that they're also tapping into our deepest biology, our own kind of addictions. You only have to go back to 7,000 years when we were in hunter-gatherer societies, and we became hooked on cheapness because in those days, cheap meant less energy expenditure, right? We learned it made a lot more sense instead of trying to run down an Impala for dinner just to reach down and grab that poor aardvark sitting there. So what do the food companies do? They have working for them chemistry labs. They call them flavor labs that mix and match chemicals to imitate the flavors in real foods. But their overarching mission is to reduce the cost of the food because they know that if we go in the grocery store and that toaster pastry we bought last week is now 15 cents less, we will have this deep biological reaction that goes, wow, I'm getting that. We'll get really excited about that. The second thing that we are by nature drawn to is variety. Humans are really adaptable and attracted to different kinds of foods. It's kind of why, we were able to move into the Arctic and fall in love with whale blubber because it was the only thing there was to eat. So what do the food companies do? That's why you have the cereal aisle with 200 brands of sugary starch pretending to offer us variety that really isn't there, knowing that we'll get excited about that. But going back to calories, as you mentioned, probably the most powerful thing they have going for us is kind of exploiting our innate attraction to calories. Because again, for most of our existence, getting calories was a really good thing, a life and death thing. Putting on body fat was a really good thing to get us through drought and famine. So we have in our guts, possibly even on our tongue, sensors that tell us how many calories there are in the product that we're eating. More calories, the more excited we get from that. And so what does the industry do? They created this phenomenon of high calorie, nutrition empty snack products that certainly in America now, Americans are getting a quarter of their day's calories from these high calorie snacks that we get excited about. And because of the mismatch between our biology, those sensors that I mentioned can't tell the difference between good calories and junk calories that don't provide any nutrition. We get excited about both in the same way.
But I suppose if I'm a company trying to sell consumers a product, it makes sense. I'm going to want to develop something that they want to buy again and again.
Yeah, totally. There was this incredible moment back in 2003. Kraft, at the time the largest processed food company, had insiders who even back then were becoming alarmed about obesity and type 2 diabetes and gout and even some cancers. And they pushed the company to do some incredible things to turn around and do the right thing by consumer health. One of those things was to put a warning label on the front of the package, showing how many calories there were in the entire package and not just a tiny serving. They stopped advertising to kids on Saturday morning cartoons. They went to their technicians and said, "Thou shalt not keep adding as much salt, sugar, fat as you want to. We're going to put caps." And those technicians looked at them and said, "Are you out of your mind? I mean, we've spent our whole lives maximizing the allure of our products. We have a whole language built into the processed food industry." They talk about engineering snackability and craveability, and one of my favorite terms, more-ishness, right? So that concept of not going for maximum of allure was just totally astonishing. And just to finish that story, Kraft did these things and it lasted until their competitors realized what they'd done and swooped into those aisles, doubling down on salt, sugar, fat, and cartoon advertising and all the things Kraft was trying to do the right thing on. It was an incredible moment in time when the industry was trying to do the right thing and failed.
Let's just dig into that food engineering a bit more. Let's say I want to produce the perfect snack and I'm working for a flavor house. What are the considerations that I'm looking at?
Well, it's not, is this healthy for somebody? Because they know when we go shopping, we may think we're looking for products that are healthy for us, but the research shows we're looking for taste and we're looking for cheapness. And so those flavor houses are looking to help the companies reduce the cost of their products by replacing, say, natural real vanilla with vanilla that's engineered sort of in a laboratory to mimic the flavor of vanilla to kind of trick us and fool us into thinking that cheap version of vanilla tastes as good as the real thing. So that's what the flavor labs are doing. And they're incredibly successful. I don't know if you guys have been hit with the pumpkin pie spice phenomena. It started here with Starbucks coffee in the fall.
You can get it in Starbucks, certainly.
Yeah, you're right. But to come up with the pumpkin pie spice, these flavor labs use as many as 80 chemical ingredients, mixing and matching and blending them together to imitate kind of the real pumpkin pie spice you would get from cinnamon and cloves and allspice. So it's an incredible amount of science that goes into their creation of these products, just from a flavor standpoint.
And what's the problem with the company using lots of different chemicals to come up with this flavoring?
Well, we really don't know. And I'll circle back to that because there's been some terrific research lately. But here's the thing. We're at a point now where the hidden cost of a diet that's heavy in processed food is about 1-to-1. Every dollar we're spending on processed food, we're having to shell out another dollar for the health consequences and the economic consequences of a diet heavy in processed food. I mean, even before the pandemic, the obesity rate in the United States, and we're talking about people having not just overweight, but having at least 35 pounds or more on their body beyond optimum health, that was pushing past 42% in the United States. And it's probably there now in 1 in 2 Americans having there. And so up until recently, scientists have only been able to sort of draw an associative connection between overeating processed food and weight gain obesity. They looked at, groups of populations, and those who ate a lot of processed food tended to be overweight and or obese. But I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, this fantastic scientist at the government NIH center did the first kind of gold standard study where he took two groups of people, put them in the eating lab for 2 weeks, gave them two very different diets, one heavy in processed food, one heavy in real, sort of scratch cooking, natural foods. And he was shocked to find that the processed food bunch gained weight, even just in 2 weeks, at an extraordinary rate. So now we can actually definitively say that there's science showing a causative relationship. It's very clear that excessive eating of processed food damages our health in lots of ways that you don't see when you go shopping. It's not plain to us when we make those purchase decisions.
But I suppose more than one thing can be true. If food is genuinely addictive, then clearly the food industry have a greater responsibility. But that wouldn't absolve us completely as consumers for not having some responsibility for the food we buy.
That was one of the pushbacks to the first book I wrote, because at the end, I mean, being a journalist, I want to believe that knowledge is power. And I ended the book by saying something like, at the end of the day, knowing all the tricks that these companies are up to will enable us to make better decisions about what to buy and what to eat. But the book came out early in England, and very first interview was from a British broadcaster. His first question was, Mr. Moss, have you been sued yet by these companies? I go, oh, thanks a lot.
Well, we do have tougher litigation in the UK.
No, I know. The proofing of that book was harsher.
I'm sure it was.
Better in the UK. But the second question was, and Mr. Moss, you write here about knowledge is power, but aren't these products as addictive, as heroin? And so where's the free will in that? And he made a really good point. That's the big question here in sort of thinking about framing these products as addiction. Are they in fact designed in a way that destroys our free will and removes kind of personal responsibility from the equation? What's so interesting about that is that the food industry, like big oil, like big tobacco, like big opiates, has done everything they can to get us to think that it's our fault. I was shocked to find out that none other than the biggest processed food companies became owners of the biggest dieting schemes and programs.
Yeah.
It started when Heinz bought Weight Watchers, of all things, and then all the companies kind of jumped in. Like, we're going to get you fat on one hand, and here's something to help you get thin, which isn't really going to help you thin because dieting programs are really problematic.
But aren't they damned if they do and damned if they don't? Let's say they produce all this processed food and they don't come up with any solution. Then they'll be criticised. Or they say, we've also produced these diet solutions to help people, so we're actually coming up with a solution.
I think it's still, other than the dieting thing, where they knew those diet programs were not very successful, and still they started pushing
But then
those.
No diet program is really successful.
Right. But nonetheless, that they would sort of buy into that industry as a way of making more money felt a little demonic to me. Up until that point, though, I would argue that, look, this is not an evil empire that intentionally set out to make us sick on its food products. These are companies doing what all companies want to do, which is to
sell more of their product.
Yeah. Make as much money as possible by selling as much product. And they do that by maximizing the allure of their product. But going forward, even with these companies in a capitalist system, I think it's really fair to ask, can they play a meaningful role going forward in everybody's, attempts now to change their eating habits for the better? And so far, I'm seeing the opposite. It's gotten harder to go into the grocery store and figure out what's good for you and what's bad.
But just going back to this issue of personal responsibility, as a kid, I can remember absorbing all the cereal ads and then trying to persuade my mum when we went to the supermarket to buy Cocoa Pops and Frosties.
Totally.
But she said we certainly weren't having chocolate for breakfast and we weren't having Frosties because that had more sugar on it. So there is some responsibility there, isn't there?
Yeah, God bless your mother. But, I think what we had over a generation was the shift. Really goes back to the 1980s, even one day overnight. It suddenly became acceptable to eat anything, anywhere, anytime. Convenience of processed foods became such a huge thing to us that we gave up that parental guidance, that parental admonitions. That's why the Lunchables became such a huge phenomena. Again, as more and more women began working outside of the home, fewer and fewer men stepped up and say, hey, I'll help out with the cooking, the food companies stepped in and said, hey, don't worry, we'll make dinner for you and lunch and breakfast. So it's a decline of personal responsibility, but that's been driven by products that are designed in a way that just makes it harder and harder to execute that kind of personal responsibility. Yeah, this stuff really gets into your head. And I was one of those people who would look at somebody who's overweight. And I mean, I confess, I would say, look, can you try harder? But then I met this guy named Don in Ontario, Canada. He works for the Census Bureau there. And he walked me through his own experience. He weighed 360 pounds, and in a little more than a year, through incredible powers of executive function, dropped half of his weight, 180 pounds. But that's when his real nightmare began, because that way of eating and those products never left his head. His whole body and brain was fighting to put that weight back on. He would have to put locks on his kitchen cabinets in order to keep control over his eating habits. He would like eat a slice of pizza and throw away the rest and sprinkle kitty litter on it to keep himself from getting up in the middle of the night and eating it.
Crikey.
And still he would and scraped it up. He would get on bus rides inner city to avoid being around any food. So the other way of sort of thinking about these products is that dependency that we get stays with us for a long, long time. And all that has to happen is that you get distracted. You have a moment of craziness in your life where you can't totally focus on not eating these products. And that's when you're going to revert. You can't go cold turkey with eating. Everybody has to eat, right?
Sure.
It makes it, in some ways, food even more trouble for us than cigarettes and alcohol.
And the other point you make about the particular addictive nature of food is the speed at which it hits our brain.
Yeah, people, and I mentioned Kevin Hall, the scientist, so he did those studies. He wasn't able to kind of figure out what it is about these processed foods, the salt, the sugar, the fat, the this and the that. My pet theory, and I'm no scientist, but my pet theory is that one of the hallmarks of processed food is the speed. It's also one of the hallmarks of addictive drugs, because the faster they hit the brain, the more apt we are to lose control over that. It's why we moved from snorting cocaine to smoking cocaine with crack, because it had a huger hit on the brain. Well, everything about the processed food industry is built for speed. The manufacturing to get the price down so you make processed cheese in one day. The packaging designed in a way so we can put our paws in and get like a whole handful of cookies or cereal to eat at once. And then, of course, the formulation, heavy on starches and salt, sugar, fat, that hits the brain with signals super, super fast.
Well, I'm not denying we have huge problems in the UK. I wonder if there are also particular North American issues, because one of the things I notice when I go to the States is the huge portions of sodas. The soda portions in the UK are just a lot smaller.
Yeah, another invention of Coca-Cola, actually. So where you could go into like a restaurant and refill your soda glass endlessly for no extra cost. That's kind of where that started from. Yeah, portions here are incredibly huge. And again, I think it sort of comes down to our being addicted to cheapness as much as we are to food, right? So we're getting more for our buck when we walk into a restaurant and the portions are huge. It's an innate biological attraction that we have. And you see that in the United States. It's incredible.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit more, Michael, about Dr. Pepper and when they were creating a new flavour of the drink, what they had to go through.
Yeah, so one of the people I met in reporting is a guy named Howard Moskowitz, trained in high math and experimental psychology at Harvard, invented the term the bliss point to describe the perfect amount of sweetness to add to products. And he walked me through the work he did for Dr. Pepper, in which he started with no less than 60 versions of a new sweetener flavor, subjected to, 3,000 consumer taste tests around the country, took the data through to his computer, and out came this data chart, L-shaped curve, kind of looks like the curve that kids get graded on in school, where at the top of the curve is like the dreaded, middle C. But for him, the top of the curve was the optimum point, the perfect amount of sweetener. Not too little, not too much. Anybody who likes sugar in their coffee can do the same test. Keep adding a little sugar until you get that perfect spot. And then if you added more, increasingly you're going to get to the point where it's like, yuck, who could like drink this? So it's the perfection, or in Howard's terms, the engineering of that perfect amount of sweetness. But then they went on and discovered that, okay, sweetness by itself works great, but what if we add fat to it, or vice versa? What if we have like a milkshake or a glass of cream? If you just drank that cream sweet, your body eventually would send you a signal saying, you're done, stop, we've had enough. But if you start adding sugar to that cream, the research showed that that part of the brain that gets us to act rationally and puts the brake on overeating kind of shuts down. And that's where you saw the industry start making so many products, which you don't find in nature, by the way, that are both sweet and fat, with this double whammy of allure going on.
But if you're going to cook with sugar at home, mostly it'll have fat as well. Ice cream, it's got sugar, milk, and cream.
Totally.
The classic sponge cake, first thing you do is cream, butter, and sugar.
Yeah.
I can't really think of a recipe that uses sugar and doesn't use fat as well.
Right. So, I mean, in some ways, the industry stole that from home cooks. But here's the thing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with salt, sugar, fat in a home cooking, recipe formulas. I make a spaghetti sauce recipe and I always add a pinch of sugar and a pinch of salt because that's what my mom used to do, right? But the industry is using those additives in enormous amounts and in ways that home cooks don't have to. And I'll give you an example. Did a story, as part of the reporting for the books about salt, which had become like this public enemy number one because of its associations with heart disease and et cetera. And so I went to the biggest companies that said, why are you guys adding so much salt to your products? And one of them, Kellogg's, the maker of cereals out in Battle Creek, Michigan, said, come on in. We're not only going to show you, but we're going to have you taste why we are dependent, if you will, on salt, or why we use so much salt. And so I went in and sat down, and it was the most god-awful meals I ever had because they made for me some of their biggest icons, but in this case, without any salt at all. So we started with the Cheez-Its, that's this cheesy cracker. And the ones that they made without salt, we couldn't even swallow them because salt adds texture and solubility. We moved on to the frozen waffles, and they came out looking and tasting like straw because salt adds color and taste to otherwise tasteless products. But here was the clincher. We went to cornflakes, which I didn't even know had salt in them. But these cornflakes without salt, we put them in the bowl, added some milk, took a bite. And before I could say anything, the chief spokeswoman for the company is sitting there. She swallows and she blurts out, metal. I taste metal, metal. And the chief scientist, who's in charge of all things technical, kind of laughs and he goes, not everybody will have that reaction. But one of the beautiful things about salt for us is that it will mask some of the off notes, bad flavors. And one of the most difficult challenges for food technicians is meat, because when meat gets rewarmed in something like a vegetable beef soup, it gives off what flavorists described as the taste of wet dog hair. And so you can probably imagine why canned soups are so salty, because it's there to cover up the taste of wet dog hair. I walked out of that meeting with Kellogg's and just this flash went off in my head, which was like, these companies are more dependent on using salt, sugar, fat in crazy ways than we are. And so the majority of salt, sugar, fat coming in your diet is not from home cooking, it's from what you're eating in these products.
And of course, certainly in the UK, because there was a move towards things being low fat, we ended up with things like yogurt having fat removed. And then to put the flavour back, they added sugar, where you'd actually been much better off with the full fat yogurt without any sugar.
Yeah, this whole area of nutritionalism, right? And I've even become skeptical of the nutrition facts box, the fine print on packages that kind of tells you how much fat and salt there is, because the companies are really good at adjusting the levels based on whatever concern we have at the moment. You can almost see in time that here in the United States, the 80s, you have a lot of concern about sugar. And so they would reduce sugar, but then add fat and salt to make up for the flavor, right? Bottom line, you don't want to reduce the allure. 90s were about fats, and they came up with fat substitutes, but then they'd crank up the sugar. Now it's more about salt. And so they're doing other things to sort of compensate for trying to reduce salt. So when we think about food as components of nutrients, I think that they win and we lose.
They might say they're just having to respond in an ever-changing market to the different demands of government and consumers.
Oh, totally. I mean, I opened my first book with The Secret Meeting, 1999. The CEOs, the biggest food companies in the world, got together privately to talk about their culpability over obesity and type 2 diabetes and cancer. And Kraft got up and pleaded with them to start doing the right thing by consumers. And the pushback from the CEOs was, look, you have to realize, I mean, we're already doing some things to help people if they want a low salt soup, we've got it there on the shelf. But you have to realize we are beholden to shareholders. There's no way we're going to mess around. They call them the family jewels, the salt, sugar, fat, if that's going to diminish our sales, because we would be irresponsible to our shareholders. And it's a really interesting thing because I've been thinking about that meeting lately and sort of asking myself, who would you put in that room to kind of come up with a different result? Who could possibly be in that room that would persuade those CEOs? But I think one of those people would have to be someone from the investment community who would agree to give them the time they would need to reformulate their products and enough time to get the public to catch up to that and get sales to sort of bounce back, because that's a huge factor in this, the influence and the power of investors to kind of drive the decision making by the heads of these companies.
Yeah, and you can see the shareholders objecting to hugely profitable products being put to one side while they research alternatives.
Yeah, it happened at Kraft, it happened at Pepsi, it's happened at Nestle to some extent, maybe Unilever too, are faced with, an investor consumer revolt because we've had a lifetime of growing familiar and comfortable with these products. And it takes time to kind of wean yourself off of them.
But is there something particular, just going back to the US food market? Because one thing I noticed when I'm in the States, everything tastes like it's got more sugar in it. So in your conversations and research with the flavor houses and the companies, do they produce different products for the US market as opposed to the European market?
Yeah, totally. There are even variations within the US market that possibly they could cater to. But yeah, if you have a confined area like that, then yes, you can formulate their products for those tastes. People in the South in the United States tend to like things sweeter. I mean, they put sugar in their iced tea to a level where you and I would just like panic. So there are those variations. But what you do see is that kind of variation globally. And this first kind of came to the attention of the food industry. An older technician at the old company, General Foods, Al Clossy, was telling me they were marketing Tang, which was like this instant orange beverage that astronauts were drinking on the way to the moon. And it became like a really big deal, a fun thing in the United States. Well, they were test marketing Tang in China. And they noticed that the further south they went, the more sugar people wanted in their products. And it's kind of hard for the companies to market a slightly sugary Tang just in southern China. The distribution isn't that kind of sophisticated.
The other thing that I notice in American food supermarkets, apart from things like Whole Foods, in some ways there's more variety because, yes, I can go in and I can get 200 types of pizza, 200 types of donut, but actually there's less variety in terms of the range of ingredients that I can buy compared to a British supermarket.
And by ingredients, do you mean the ingredients in a single product or
if I want to go in and buy, ginger, cardamom, spinach, all of the raw ingredients that I might have as a cook, that I'm just conscious there's actually less variety. It depends how you define variety.
Right.
Yes, lots of pizza, lots of donuts, but actually in terms of completely different food.
Well, that's so interesting.
I would argue there's less in a US supermarket.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have to bring you to Calistan's. It's on 23rd Street in Lexington in Manhattan. It's this fantastic store. They will have like 20 different kinds of black pepper on the shelf. It's just like thousands and thousands of varieties. But you're right, in the supermarket, they're making space calculations. Shelf space is huge.
Whereas in Britain, your average supermarket, Tesco, Sainsbury's, these are not for rich people. This is for everyone. You can get that range of ingredient.
Oh, that's really interesting. And you're not seeing that. I mean, there is some phenomenon in the US of sort of a curated sort of menu of items. Costco was really big on that, right? Where instead of selling 20 types of TVs, they would like do their own kind of consumer reports analysis and pick like the three best TVs and only present those. So there has been this move in some big box stores to reduce the number of items as a way of helping consumers make a better choice, if you will. And maybe that doesn't always work.
But one of the things that puzzles me about this whole thing is, and I don't know if there's something wrong with my taste buds, but I actually don't find processed food terribly satisfying to eat. I think it's got
What?
I think it's got less taste than if you make a really nice home cooked meal. I mean, I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've been at McDonald's. Perhaps I'm just missing the relevant genes. The idea of, say, a Twinkie.
Yeah.
If it was a lovely home cooked cake, great.
I think it goes back to your mom, Liz. I mean, my mom let us eat Twinkies, and those things got in our heads. And Twinkies were my best friend growing up. And so you have that emotional attachment and that deep memory that drives it. Maybe something else too. I mean, Jocelyn Bradley, the Bronx teenager who threw McDonald's for making her obese, said to me, it's not like I really loved McDonald's. It's like it kind of filled a hole in me. And he looks at people at McDonald's who are eating alone, especially, and sees people who are incredibly lonely. And they're eating McDonald's not because it tastes great, but because it fills that emotional void in them. I've also heard of discussions with mothers who are on what used to be called food stamps, food assistance. They'll tell you, we eat at McDonald's not because we like it, right? Or because we know it's good for us nutritionally. We eat there because it's the only place we can get our family together to have a family meal. I think you'd be surprised how many people are eating them not because they really taste good. And they've lost touch with the deliciousness of a home scratch cooked pot pie that you sit down and eat with family and friends. And we've just kind of forgotten how rich and beautiful that is compared to a hot pocket you're going to eat walking down the street by yourself.
Is it possible also that some of us are just more likely to become addicted to food, the way that probably some of us are more likely to become addicted to drugs or alcohol?
Yeah, well, one of the first pushbacks I got from the industry is that, well, look, not everybody will eat a whole bag of Oreos in one sitting. So how can you blame our product? Well, addiction happens on a spectrum. Different people get affected in different ways at different times in their lives. I mean, there are people who could smoke one cigarette a day. I'll give you another example. The former general counsel, top lawyer, Philip Morris, we were sitting around talking about it, and he said, I was one of those lucky people who could have one cigarette a day in a business meeting, put the pack away, and never think about it again until like the next day. But I couldn't go near a bag of our Oreo cookies. This is when they owned Nabisco and Oreos, for fear of losing control and eating half the bag in one sitting. So I think you see that happening out there too. And that's a really important way of thinking about these products. They don't have to cause everybody to lose control all the time to be considered a substance that's problematic for our well-being.
But I suppose the crux of this is it's not clear that the food companies know or knew that they were producing foodstuffs that were addictive. Where's the smoking gun?
Well, I would agree with you. I mean, okay, smoking gun, we'll get to that. But that 1990 meeting, as a journalist, that starts the clock ticking for me, because they knew in 1999 that at least, but their own people were warning them. Not only that, the tobacco company, Philip Morris, privately warned the food managers, this is now 2001, that you guys are going to face as much trouble over salt, sugar, fat, and obesity as we are over cigarettes and lung cancer.
You say privately warned. What's the evidence for that?
Oh, just interviews that I had with the former CEOs of Philip Morris, who said that they sat down with the food guys and saw this coming, because They had just gone through the incredible litigation that forced them to settle with the state attorneys general. And not only that, but they were looking for smoking guns in their food divisions that might make them susceptible to that litigation. And I'm fairly convinced that after they did that hunt for smoking guns, they really didn't come up with any because the food industry is kind of different than tobacco industry. You didn't have food scientists sitting around writing memos saying, wow, if we just tweak this formula a little bit, people are going to be out of their minds addictive. They didn't kind of have to say that. They're more like, oh, if we tweak it this way, this is going to be like super yummy and people will really buy it. And it was even the head of Coca-Cola, Jeffrey Dunn, who said to me, there really isn't any smoking gun here. We've got this sugar water, with bubbles that we're selling. But it's what it is. It's on its face what it is. So the idea of sort of needing a smoking gun to understand, even if you're inside these companies, I don't think you do. When they're willing to think about what they're doing, I think they realize, and I think they have for years and years, realized the problem that they've created.
But is there not a difference between thinking that your food may cause obesity and thinking that it may be addictive?
Well, I mean, what's the definition? 50% of the country being at least 35 pounds overweight, if not an utter loss of control of your eating habits. I mean, unless you want that weight, I'll never again look at somebody individually and judge them by their weight. But as a population, that to me is the epitome of a definition of utter loss of control of our eating habits, which is the definition of addiction. I was reading some transcripts of legal proceedings, and the CEO of Philip Morris was asked, what's your definition of addiction? And he came up with what I thought was the perfect definition, which was like a repetitive behavior that some people find difficult to control. He was talking about cigarettes, but that fits so many of our relationships to food just as well.
It also could potentially apply to such a wide number of activities, from watching television to playing sport.
My God, a little while ago, there's this guy named Tristan Harris who starred in a documentary called The Social Dilemma. He was a wonder kid at Google who invented crazy stuff that got us hooked on technology. Then he totally did an about face, and now he's running something called the Center for Humane Technology, where he's trying to warn people about the dangers of smartphone addiction. And he came to me. It was hilarious, Liz, because he had a copy of Salt, Sugar, Fat, and in his kind of tech genius way, he had highlighted in a different color every other paragraph in the book. And I said, you're really into food, huh? And he goes, no, not at all. But your companies are doing exactly what my companies, the tech industry, are doing to create products that we can't resist, that are just by nature of their design addictive. And in his view, there's some synergy potential there where we could learn from other industries creating these products. I mean, look, I'm personally not wedded to the word addictive. I'm very happy calling our dependency on processed food a very, very bad habit. Some of the pushback to addiction was it's such a strong word that you don't want to leave people without any hope for having some role themselves for changing their habits. That was some of the first pushback. But whether you call it addiction or a very, very bad habit, I think the goal and the outcome is hopefully going to be the same.
Okay, Michael, so I make you US president tomorrow.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to change things?
I've been thinking about this. I'd want to take like one zip code, maybe in the Bronx in New York, in order to tackle, say, just obesity, or could be type 2 diabetes. I mean, there are 10 things you'd have to do all at the same time because it's such a complex issue now. I would start by putting a garden in every school, not just to feed the kids spinach, but to get them excited about things they'd never saw before, like a radish. But then you'd have to have a situation where they could bring that radish home, get their parents excited. So the next thing you'd have to do is alter the agricultural system. 90% of the acres in the United States are planted in field corn for sugar and then soybeans as an ingredient in processed food. And the rest 10% is planted with everything else we should be eating more of, all the fruits and vegetables and nuts and what have you. You've got to like flip that around to make good ingredients possible so that you could then go to Nestle technicians and say, can you make a hot pocket that's stuffed with broccoli? Initially, they go, no, it's going to be too expensive. But if you change the ag system in a way that makes vegetables more affordable, I mean, I love frozen fruits and vegetables. And one of my favorite things to buy in the grocery store is this big bag of frozen blueberries that are wild grown in Maine. They are delicious. They're relatively inexpensive. They're incredibly convenient. And they may even be better for you nutritionally than fresh blueberries that sit around, in the warehouse for weeks coming from Chile or what have you. I can't go through all 10 things, but they're all kind of designed to help us change the way we value food and then enable us to act on this. But really, the most important things is you've got to be doing a bunch of things at once, because just trying to change one aspect isn't going to do it.
Well, really intriguing, Michael. Perhaps you should stand for election. Thanks so much for speaking today. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for your time and thanks for your work.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the show, if you could leave a review, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.